All right. Hey, it's a pleasure being here, Mindy. Thank you for inviting me to come back because this is
You're
my
welcome.
second.
Very happy
Yeah,
to have you back.
yeah. So, one of the things that I truly enjoy is being able to share my learning. And so, as a lifelong learner, I continue to take and increase my knowledge and understanding of how we arrived at this point in our agile journey and where it might go on from here. Now, while I read and had conversations and write to continue to cement my learning, I've discovered that we're at a pivot point where we should take a new view on Agile as a philosophy. Throughout my military career, I've been very fortunate to be mentored by some very high performing leaders in the special operations community, including Navy SEALs and Green Berets. My search for knowledge has led me to visit Toyota and learn from a former Toyota executive. And now I'm being mentored by other outstanding business executives as I continue to grow professionally. Early in my Navy career, first of all, I wanted to bring you into a story about something that happened early in my Navy career. I served on board several submarines. I was on board the USS Archerfish, SSN 678, and the USS Wyoming, SSBN 742. I also completed a patrol on the USS Ohio and a patrol on the USS Maine. One of the most unique points about that whole portion of my professional journey was that I was a member of the commissioning crew on board the USS Wyoming, and I have my name cast on a brass plaque that hangs on the bulkhead outside the crew mess. But I digress a minute. So what I wanted to do is share with you kind of the difference between fast attack submarines and ballistic missile submarines. On the Archerfish, which was a fast attack, we specialized in different unique mission sets, and we deployed Navy SEALs and Army Rangers and Green Berets, as well as collected intelligence as part of our mission set. In my opinion, the AFISH was a good example of what Agile should be as a ship and crew. We were prepared to adapt our mission set as needed to deliver outcomes that National Command Authority saw fit. And so I'm going to share my screen real quick because I'm going to head on over to Mural here in a few moments. Whereas, getting back to the story on the Wyoming, as a ballistic missile submarine, we had one mission, and that was a mission that didn't change. It was, part of the strategic nuclear defense triad that also consisted of land-based missile systems, as well as aircraft that were nuclear weapons capable. There was no flexibility in the mission set or how the mission was completed. In a sense, not very agile. And this leads me to how several large companies operate today. Over time, they grew from being responsive to competition and market change to being reactive to those influences. Many have chosen to embrace overhauls of their organization, and some have been successful and others have mixed results. So before we dive into the discussion, I want to jump to Mural for a couple of minutes. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a sticky storm. And what I wanted to ask all of you to do in the sticky storm, I'm going to drop a link into the chat here on Zoom, and I want you to join me. And my question for you is, what does flow mean to you, both personally as well as professionally? And I'm going to put about 2 minutes up on the clock. And the goal here is not to get the right or wrong answer, but really to join the conversation, to level set and kind of build shared understanding about the concept of flow. Because it takes it takes on different characteristics for different people. And specifically tonight, we're going to talk about how flow relates in business. And I know that there have been other speakers who have joined on different webinars, and they've talked about different types of flow, but we're going to talk about something very specific tonight. And it's rather unique, and I will say it's kind of on its own a different concept that not many folks are familiar with, at least not yet. So if you would, grab a sticky on the board, join me here on Mural real quick and just kind of write your comments. I see a couple of yes have already joined, and please feel free. We've got about a minute and a half remaining on this, and just want to get your thoughts and feelings before we launch into the overall presentation. And let me know if you haven't been able to access that link. I'll be more than happy to drop it in the chat again. Certainly. Okay, there we go. All right, I'm going to go away from that, given that I'm sharing my screen. I like that. An idea or theory containing different conceptual elements, and typically one considered to be subjective and not based on empirical evidence. Very interesting, very detailed response. Thank you for that. Great. Flow comes from the interactions with others when structured practice becomes unnoticed, and you are, I think, unconscious of the act of doing. So, and I'm doing a little bit of loose interpretation here. We've got about 3-4 seconds remaining. It's a smooth process of dynamic movement, and flow is not movement. Okay. I like that. Some contrasting viewpoints. I'll let a couple more in there. Flow is when I feel focused and engrossed in my work. I like that as well. And actually, there's one of my favorite authors, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, wrote a book in the 90s called Flow. A very interesting book, and it really kind of actually, it is a basis for what we're going to be talking about. But Csikszentmihalyi was interested in individual flow, not necessarily group flow or team flow, or even better, corporate flow. So I appreciate that. And hey, Laura, thank you for coming out. You and I know each other, and I'm glad that you're here this evening. So, and I like that, especially when you're playing piano or writing, and that's a perfect illustration of personal flow. So I appreciate that. So without further delay, we're gonna dig into flow, and I'm gonna open up my next slide. And we're going to do the introduction now. So, well, shoot, why is my introduction? There we go. Sometimes it just takes click on the slide to get it to show up. So, one of the challenges that with transforming ways of work is a framework in many cases is applied universally without regard to the business or organizational context. And without contextual understanding of an organization, risk arises from transforming effort. And the point I'm about to make is controversial for some, although maybe not all. Flow cannot, applying flow in a one-size-fits-all framework across the organization does have a probability. I'm not going to give you a measure of probability, but a probability of failure. So forcing a one-size-fits-all framework on the entire organization has a probability of failure. Now, I know that will probably bring some objections from you as an audience, and I'm perfectly good with that. And if I'm wrong, I invite you to change my mind. But please bring me facts. I don't really want anecdotes or case studies or stories. I need a factual basis to refute this statement. So it is a telling sign that forcing team structures on work groups can cause more confusion than bringing clarity around the work or focus on the work that needs to be done. The same goes for reorganizing everyone into guilds or tribes. It's not a knock against the Spotify model, but something similar can occur if we're not being wise in understanding the organizational context. I would like to suggest that asking questions prior to starting the transformation should be a leading action. One of the questions that probably ought to be asked first is, does the proposed organizational change make sense based on what we know about our work and how our people are doing that work? The answers should serve to lead to additional conversations. Follow-on questions might be, do we know what the problem is that we're trying to solve by reorganizing? And it might be one of the several focal points that I'm going to quickly list off. We talk about growth, both top line and bottom line. We talk about improving the quality of products and services. There's also the discussions around more efficient delivery of products and services, as well as conversations around reducing attrition, enabling the adoption of feature bundles, or cost reduction. These are at the forefront of much of business dialogue today, and it should be noted that equally as important are the discussions around time to market, value creation or enhancement, and reducing business cost. One of my favorite topics, and this is where my focus is professionally right now, is how do we create and innovate faster than our competitors? For the remainder of our time, I intend to cover the points already highlighted on the slide and how they can influence better performance and transformation outcomes. The bottom line up front on this is there appears to be no time for continuous improvement, Kaizen, if you will. Some of this may be due to the matrix structure of many companies where you have two managers for one employee who's actually doing the work. Then we try and overlay a universal agile framework, and it's worth repeating, there's that probability of adoption failure. And this is where the flow system, or TFS, creates leverage. First, by recognizing the problems, then understanding the context around those problems, there's an increased probability of selecting the right tools that will aid in the effort to pivot and change the company's direction. The tools include approaches and methods and techniques that enable and scaffold change. All tools have utility, but there are limits that need to be identified prior to their employment. Think of a hammer, nails, and screws. Using a hammer to pound in nails works quite well, but not so much for those screws. The concept in operation here is bounded applicability, choosing the right tool for the right job. It's equally important to know how to connect the tools for a multiplying effect within the underlying context. This helps to curb the enthusiasm for prescribing a common framework and shifting the organizational design to all teams when maybe there's not really a driving requirement or need to do so. Another way to frame this might be TFS is enterprise level DevOps. Like DevOps, TFS eliminates, mitigates, and resolves constraints to optimize the flow of value through the entire organizational system. And based on where business is at today, TFS should be a part of future conversations. It can address all the points shown on the slide. But first, I want to go back in time a little bit and start with lean fundamentals. Lean fundamentals underpin the flow system. And when I look back to the origin of quality as it's been defined over the course of the last 50 or more years, I look and see Toyota. it's been at the forefront of the modern quality movement. A little bit of history on this. W. Edwards Deming was a, a revolutionary thinker in management thinking and practice, as well as manufacturing quality in Japan after World War II. As a result of his efforts, along with many other Americans who accepted the challenge of helping to rebuild Japan, the quality movement was born in Japan. And ultimately, that movement gave Japan a competitive advantage in manufacturing. And as a result, Toyota went from building automated looms to building automobiles. Fast forward to the 1970s and 80s, and the US auto industry had significant issues with build quality. Detroit auto manufacturers looked to Deming as well as Japan for insights on how to improve their quality. In one of those instances, a partnership was actually born between Toyota and General Motors, which resulted in a plant that was co-operated called NUMMI in Fremont, California. And if you know your history about NUMMI actually manufactured several lines of cars, both for the Toyota brand as well as for General Motors. And out of this quality movement, there came the term lean. And lean really seeks to remove waste from the system while respecting the people who make the system work. As well, lean is a way of thinking about work, about how work is performed, not how work is imagined. This covers the entire business and not just the assembly of goods. Lean thinking looks at the entire value stream from idea to repeat business in the future. And once the business understands how work flows through the system, then approaches, methods, and techniques can be used to increase adaptive and flexible responses to change. Again, the foundation for this, for TFS, is lean fundamentals, which lean fundamentals lead to lean thinking. Now, I've got a set of web links I'm going to share with you later in the presentation, and the mural is going to remain open for quite a while, and those web links will be available to you. And I've curated a series of videos that are going to help increase your understanding, not just on lean fundamentals and Toyota production system, but also some of the other topics that I intend to cover this evening. So how many of you studied biology in school? And if you did, did you learn a little bit about DNA? Hey, thank you, Laura. That's great. I hope that in the process of studying biology that you learn that DNA is one of the building blocks of living organisms. Well, the same concept applies here to organizations in the way that we can approach organizational change. Just like genetic research splices DNA as part of experimentation to combat disease, so too the triple helix of flow can be grafted into a company's DNA. And you might be wondering, what is the triple helix? Well, I'm glad that you asked, rhetorically anyway. The concept consists of the helices of complexity thinking, distributed leadership, and team science. And within each strand of the helix are approaches, methods, and techniques that support the concept previously mentioned. For example, in distributed leadership, the behavior of people who lead people and teams, it includes decision-making, collaboration, complex facilitation, and more as part of these techniques and tools. By splicing these approaches into the organization, we can equip the entire team, meaning the entire company, with ways to address VUCA. And VUCA is a military term or a military abbreviation for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So instead of reacting, the enterprise can respond to change, and often before it's seen in the market. Now we're going to dig a little bit deeper into each one of these helices. With many companies becoming annoyed or worse, hostile to transformation efforts, is it any wonder that large consulting firms who will remain nameless have entered into this space? I think we've reached a tipping point where commodity agile or digital transformation is being marketed by the agile industrial complex, which has co-opted and twisted the intent of the Manifesto for Agile Software Development. TFS, through the helices of complexity thinking, distributed leadership, and team science, brings together a way of returning to the intent of the Agile Manifesto, anchored in the foundation of lean thinking. Each of the helix is supported by approaches that have been proven to work independently of each other to achieve desired results based on an understanding of business context. They bring together, in total or in part, the best of military experience, business practice, and academic research. For example, psychological safety in the distributed leadership helix has been extensively researched by Dr. Amy Edmondson. Dr. Edmondson looked across both public and the private sector to identify what enables high performance in teams. For her, based on her research, psychological safety is a key contributing factor to team success. In the team science helix, Doctors Eduardo Salas and Scott Tannenbaum studied the concept of teamwork training. Their research concludes it is effective for enabling work groups to evolve into teams. And I can say from personal experience, I know this to be true based on the team training I attended while serving in the US Navy. For example, one of the neat things that I got to do was attend basic enlisted submarine school. And during BESS, we were put through a series of training simulations to include a simulator that allowed us to dive and drive a submarine, both a ballistic missile class submarine as well as a fast attack class submarine. And through those team building evolutions, we learned more about the effective operation of submarines than we could have ever learned academically in the classroom. The same went for our experience with firefighting and going through firefighting training and simulation, as well as flooding training and simulation. And the coolest one by far was the submarine escape and rescue simulation. And in all of this, I know that when we do teamwork training and we bring in all the effective elements of how to work as a team, from when I reported to my first submarine to when I signed off my last submarine, I felt very well equipped to operate the submarine in addition to fight casualties on board. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper into psychological safety here for a short while. Psychologically safe environments are where team members or employees can freely express their opinions and ask questions without being ridiculed or reprimanded. The best descriptor is that team members and employees are free to be candid, as long as their views and criticisms remain professional. The psychological safety eliminates the culture of fear. In the Toyota production system, employees can freely pull the andon cord. The andon cord consists of a pull cord the length of the production line, or sometimes a button that workers can activate to stop production and warn management in case of significant issue or the potentiality problem. Employees freely pull the andon cord when they see a problem with no fear of being reprimanded or punished for stopping production. The andon cord acts as a metaphor for a psychologically safe working environment where employees are free to question and probe to assure that the right decisions or actions are being taken. And it also ensures that the right people are taking action, are taking those actions. Psychological safety portrays the following features. It has a shared expectation, shared purpose, a confidence in being heard, accepting failure, and continuous learning. Sounds very agile to me. Now, I want to move to some details in teamwork training. And by the way, the links that you see in the slide are also going to be open and available in another area of the mural as well. So team training is training there in which teams are used to increase individual procedural knowledge and proficiency in doing a job, along with developing the interpersonal skills to function as a cohesive unit or team. Teamwork training focuses on the team as a unit rather than concentrating on any single member. Research has shown that teams with teamwork training perform better than teams with no training. Teams must be trained in teamwork skills before they can become effective teams. I know this from professional experience, so I can validate that personally. Teamwork skill development is one ingredient that separates mediocre performing teams with no teamwork skill training and with high performing teams and those who do have teamwork skill training. You cannot achieve high performing teams without first developing teamwork skills. Teamwork training must identify the requisite skills for the contextual setting. As well, focus on learning the requisite teamworking skills. Include training for all team members altogether, include briefing and debriefing as part of the training activities, and be done in real time. And finally, it all should be evaluated for effectiveness. Another tool that I want to introduce as part of this presentation is the concept of red teaming. This has its roots in the military. And as part of combat training, a red team or teams are used to test a unit or units' ability to act defensively or offensively in battle. Red teaming is, by and large, a process to test policies, processes, and procedures by taking an oppositional approach to looking at and validating their practicality in the operational environment. Assumptions are laid out and critiqued so that weaknesses can be identified, risks can be mitigated or managed based on known and simulated conditions. Having done this several times before I deployed, I can tell you that this is an effective tool. And without doubt, I say that had I not gone through red teaming exercises, I don't think I would have fared as well as I did during the deployment, the 2 deployments that I did, boots on the ground into Afghanistan. The approach forces groups to assess themselves and challenges them to be responsive versus reactive in future tactical, operational, and strategic planning. In this, red teaming is often associated with cyber or physical security. It should be considered for use in other business areas as well. Red teaming is a cognitive approach designed to develop new pathways for better decision-making within a red team challenges the plans, policies, systems, or assumptions by adopting an adversarial approach. Red teaming uses a set of tools and techniques designed to mitigate cognitive bias, enhance critical thinking skills, create self-awareness, and improve empathy. The use of red team, an example of one of the tools within the red teaming, usually consists of the impartial observer tasked with challenging a plan and helping to identify gaps and threats to create countermeasures before the implementation of said plan takes place. Red teaming techniques include challenging explicit and implicit assumptions, exposing hidden information, and developing alternatives to uncover biases. Red teaming methods include critical analysis of the team's processes, requiring teams to have already developed a high level of psychological safety and to have developed strong teamwork skills. Now, I want to shift into the final helix, the helix of complexity thinking. And this helix, I'm going to lead off with something that you're probably a bit familiar with, which is Cynefin. So in the complexity thinking helix, many of us are familiar with empirical process control, prototypes, and the use of storytelling. These concepts and others enable us to perform safe-to-fail experiments while developing new products and services for our business. Now, one of my favorite tools in complexity thinking is the Cynefin framework. And you might be familiar with Dave Snowden's work as he introduced Cynefin back in the early 2000s. I've seen the illustration used in this particular slide in a number of different presentations, and it helps organizations and teams to understand the work that they are performing. The Cynefin framework developed by Dave includes 5 domains. The framework is primarily used to consider the dynamics of a situation, decisions, perspectives, conflicts, and changes to consensus for decision-making under uncertainty. These domains provide clarification as to what types of methods, tools, or techniques may be required when operating in each of the domains. It enables executives to see things from new viewpoints, assimilate complex concepts, and address real-world problems and opportunities. Using Cynefin can help executives sense which contexts they're in so that they can make better decisions and avoid issues that arise when their current management style causes them to make mistakes. Cynefin is a Welsh word that signifies the multiple factors in our environment and our experience that influence us in ways that we can never fully understand. When dealing with complex problems, such as climate change, the problem is ill-defined and the solution is unknown. Components that lead to the issues that we're experiencing with climate change are also unknown. Methods, techniques, and tools for problems within the complex domain are drastically different than those found in the simple domain. The framework enables us to categorize problems into those domains and then allows us to select the appropriate tools that can be used to address these problems. For example, in the simple or complicated domains, we may choose lean tools, whereas in the complex domain, we may need sense making. The domains of knowledge for the framework include simple and obvious, complicated, complex, chaotic, and disordered. It's a decision-making framework, and as of 2019, Dave has suggested that changing simple and obvious domain to clear. Sense-making, as Dave has expressed, helps us to figure out which domain we're operating in at a given moment. And at times, we think we're operating in the complex domain when we're actually operating in the complicated domain and vice versa. Now, I want to run through sense-making here as well, as it's a technique that's designed to aid our understanding of complex problems and conditions or environments. Sense-making aids in developing stories around our environments in which individuals and groups can begin developing shared mental models to understand the complex environment or the problem better. In complex environments, stories and narratives aid in understanding the conditions of the environmental situation. During firefighting efforts, as in putting out a fire, not being engaged in combat, teams of firefighters continuously communicate their view of their surroundings to other team members, aiding each team member's understanding of their current situation. These stories from multiple team members assist in the team's ability to make sense of their surrounding. Sense making includes the following characteristics: interactions and conversations, clear frames of reference and relevant past experiences, neglected details in the current environment, and updating impressions of what things have changed, plausible stories of what could be happening, and actions that clarify thinking and help improve understanding. Sense making is the most effective when it is done in real time. So we're going to go a little bit deeper into Cynefin, and I'm going to share with you some of the dynamics and the liminals in Cynefin. At its most basic, the framework allows us to distinguish between three different types of systems. Ordered systems, which cause and effect relationships are pretty clear and discoverable through analysis. Complex systems, in which the only way to understand the system is to interact with it. And chaotic systems, in which turbulence prevails and immediate stabilization action is required. The most things have value within boundaries, and Cynefin tries to establish what they are and gain an understanding of what it takes to move between these domains. Something that has historically been called Cynefin dynamics. And although some people tend to take a static view of Cynefin domains, Cynefin has always been intended to look at the dynamics of the situation. One or more famous early papers was entitled The New Dynamics of Strategy. And it definitely helped Dave focused on the dynamics in Cynefin and provided the influence for much of Dave's thinking and focus on the boundary states and making decisions around crossing in between those boundaries. A decade on from the new dynamics of strategy, the introduction of liminality, these spaces here in between, helped the framework and gave it a new way of addressing the concept of Cynefin dynamics. And critically, it created a place to situate the complex to complicated transition. As a bonus, it also shaped a shallow dip in chaos, and by happy accident, paved the way for adding the apparatic turn, which is in the center. And that's characterized by deliberate puzzlement through paradox and the microdomain for computing expertise. Using Scrum to move from the complex domain to the complicated domain has been insightful for me. I say this because there are times where we don't know what the problem is, let alone what the potential solutions might be. Scrum fits nicely into the liminal or in-between space, illustrated by this area right here. We'll move from the complex to the complicated by using a series of safe-to-fail experiments. We can identify the problem, and once the problem is more or less defined, then we can shift from the complex domain to the complicated domain, as illustrated in Cynefin. Another tool that I like to use in complexity thinking is the Boyd cycle. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Boyd cycle, but if you are, you can raise your hand or give me a thumbs up. And I am guessing that most people are not familiar with the Boyd cycle. So that's wonderful. And if you're not, maybe the term OODA loop would jog your memory a little bit. Did that help you? I know some people are familiar with that. Yes, I appreciate the thumbs up. So we're going to shift now to the Boyd cycle or OODA loop. So don't worry about the fact that you're not familiar with either one of those names. Colonel John Boyd created the cycle to assist fighter pilots make sense of their environments as they change during combat, and to respond with the appropriate tactics as a result of those changes. And I can say from personal experience, that OODA is one of the most effective examples of how to manage rapid change in VUCA conditions. The Boyd cycle has 4 significant features to it. These are the observe, orient, decide, and act components. And as well, they have multi-factor inputs that use feed forward and feedback channels across the senses. The OODA loop is a nonlinear decision-making process, a guide for action. The loop represents nearly 40 years of work by Colonel Boyd, who combined lessons from aviation, strategy, science, early complexity thinking, and the Toyota production system. The OODA loop is a decision-making process, and it ensures that all relevant available information is observable and trains the observer how to orient him or herself for effective decision-making. Once the right decisions are determined, it enables rapid execution of those decisions. However, it is possible first to act and then observe and orient to the outcomes of the action. And this will inform future decision-making. The OODA loop favors implicit over explicit decision-making processes. It contains sense-making, observing and through observation and orientation loops that feature the separation of decision from the outcome when assessing individual and organizational performance. The OODA loop is described as an evolving, open-ended, and far from equilibrium process of self-organization, emergence, and natural selection. The OODA loop can be described or can begin at any stage, at any point, and is dependent on the problem or the situation at hand. The components of the OODA loop include the observe, orient, decide, and act, and iterative cycle. The focal point is the orientation. And in orientation, we have heuristics, cognitive biases, and established beliefs that determine how individuals and organizations observe, decide, and act. So between Cynefin, PDCA and PDSA, which are also known as the Shewhart and the Deming cycles, and the Boyd cycle, these should be considered default for complexity thinking. And I say that knowing that there are many more tools in the Helix that are equally as valuable when applied in the proper context. So the good news is that in closing this particular webinar, we have covered all 4 of these points. And in summary, we've talked through the evolution of lean and agile thinking. And we've gone back to lean fundamentals with the discussion around W. Edwards Deming, or Dr. Deming, if you prefer. And we've looked at the triple helix of flow, which is organization DNA. And all of this was built on proven concepts that have been backed by research as well as practical experience. So I want to tell you that you have access to all of this at theflowguides.org, and as well in its voluminous detail in the flow system book. Now, I'll probably have to drop my screen, but I've read it and I was thoroughly enamored by all of these concepts. And I have the distinct pleasure of actually having one of the co-authors on the call this evening. And Nigel, if you wouldn't mind coming off of mute, I just had a couple of questions that I wanted to ask you, because having such an esteemed co-author on a call like this is truly a delight. So thank you for joining this evening.
I don't know about the word esteemed, but I think that the presentation you gave everybody's probably got all their heads hurting and aching, and you've probably given them an extensive study curriculum rather than giving them anything they can take away and apply immediately. And Laura knows what I'm talking about because she's been through this training in the past. But I think you did a pretty good job, Tim. I think you did a pretty good job. Just for the record, PDCA was nothing to do with Deming. PDSA came from Deming, PDCA. There's a whole book coming on that probably in the next year from Charlie Protzman, and I'll be involved in that in some way, which will really tell us the original history of PDCA, which predates Deming. There's a spoiler for the tape.
There we go. So Nigel, I've got to ask, so what prompted not only the development of the flow guide, but of course the subsequent writing of the flow system book?
Well, I mean, it all started when I was at Toyota. I mean, for those that don't know me, I spent some time at Toyota the last couple of decades, and I left at the end of 2019. But as their chief of agile at the time, I was starting to realize that the problem wasn't that we needed more frameworks and we needed more tools and we needed more stuff. The problem was people didn't realize, you mentioned bounded applicability earlier, which is the limitation of each tool. All tools have utility. I use a visual sometimes of a hammer and a toothbrush. They're both great tools, but don't mix them up for different reasons. I'm sure you'll understand why. So it wasn't the fact we didn't have enough tools and we didn't need any more one-size-fits-all prescriptions from the big consulting houses. And so I realized that it was actually people didn't know how to use the tools together in different contexts. And you could go through many airports and buy, a whole plethora of books on leadership and sit on a plane and then toss it when you got off the other end of the flight because it gave you no new news. And then there was this whole area of team science, which my co-author, Professor Turner, is an absolute brilliant scientist and professor in that area, was sort of revealing all these new things about how we actually train people to be teams, because we tell people to be in teams. Every framework worth its salt will tell you to be in teams. None of them tell you how to be a team. They just tell you go be a team. And then, of course, the work you mentioned from my friend Dave Snowden and the deep work he'd done over the years in complexity thinking and understanding where there are certain problems we're trying to solve. You mentioned climate change as an example. There are problems we're trying to solve that just aren't solvable with the current range of tools. They need new thinking, new approaches, new techniques, and that's where complexity thinking comes in. And within organizations, most of us all accept that organizations are complex. I have a theory or a proposition that all organizational complexity is human derived. And my test for that is remove the humans, is the problem still complex? And since complexity is a human construct, I pretty much can't be proved wrong on that. But the reality of it is that I wanted to bring all this sort of fields and bodies of knowledge together and show how they could interact and intertwine and interconnect. That's where the triple helix idea was born. And so really this was a way of enabling people to see things in a wider lens. Where does Scrum fit? Where does the tools from Lean Thinking, Six Sigma, and of course all these other words you mentioned fit? And how can I combine them and apply them and actually solve contextually based problems? And if you're looking for universality, which is this idea of a single answer to solve all the problems of an organization, you're going to be very disappointed. In fact, just to mention, Dave's bringing out a new tool. You can Google it if you look up something called estuarine mapping, an estuary like an inlet to a river, but estuarine mapping. And he's using hexagonal shapes, which are commonly known as hexes. And we'll be bringing out some supporting artifacts as well to fit into this new mapping model he's bringing. But that's a new visualization technique that coaches can learn and use really in the workplace and with organizations they coach and work within to see how different techniques fit together and where certain techniques may work better together in certain contextual situations, and then maybe revisit after you've done something and reassemble and see how effective they were and look for new patterns, for new options of some sort of facilitated exercise moving forward with different groups. So there's a lot of cool stuff coming out of this world at the moment.
Outstanding. So I do want to give some time for questions. And since I've got you on the call, I know that there may be a few, not
Great.
just
you bring me in when the questions come.
Oh,
you
of
do all the
course.
talking and then go ahead. Sorry.
Hey, so Mindy, do we have any questions from folks who joined this evening?
There are none in the chat box, but feel free to unmute or type your questions in the chat box.
I think all the heads are really aching and hurting with all the knowledge. As Tim mentioned, there's a free guide like the Scrum Guide. It's a little bit more comprehensive than the Scrum Guide, and that's available at flowguides.org. And that will give you a shallow dive. Tim mentioned shallow dive into chaos, but it'll give you a shallow dive into a lot of these concepts. And there's a lot of free material we've released and a lot of stuff we've published to help people understand them. But I mean, Tim mentioned some really good ones out there that you can dig into. I'd really highly recommend people study the Cynefin framework. It seems complicated to begin with, but actually when you understand it, it becomes really quite simple and quite easy to understand, but it's extremely powerful for helping you navigate these different domains of problems and problem solving, in which techniques may support or help guide you in that type of work. Tim mentioned the OODA loop. I mean, the OODA loop for me is telling you, it's describing how you do what you do, but it's not telling you how to do what you do. So it's really helping you understand how people make decisions, but it's not telling you how to make decisions. But once you understand how decisions are made and how cognition works, then it's a very powerful tool to help you understand how to support and coach people more effectively. And of course, Tim mentioned red teaming earlier on. Funny, I was writing an article about red teaming earlier today. And red teaming is an incredibly powerful technique, as Tim mentioned, cognitive activity. But in simple terms, when your organization's made a plan, you bring in completely independent observers to attack the plan viciously, aggressively, and find all the weak points in it. Because then you end up by securing those weak points, and you actually have an extremely robust plan, but with built-in resilience. Robustness is its ability to withstand attack. Resilience is its ability to sort of pivot and adapt when it's under attack and choose different methods. So resilience is agility for the agile folks in the room. So this is another area I would spend quite a bit of time reading. The Flow Guide covers that to some degree. Of course, the book covers it in more depth. You can even read the book free of charge at the University of North Texas website. If you just, I'll get a link to this group, but if you just search on Google for the Flow System book, University of North Texas, there's a place where you can go read it a page by page, free of charge. You can't download it. You take 500 screenshots if you really wanted to, but that would probably be miserable. It's cheaper to buy the Kindle edition or less effort, but at least you can go there and find pieces of that you're interested in and see if it's something that might intrigue you a little bit. The one thing I will say is the flow system is not a framework. It's not a recipe. It's not a methodology. It's not a prescription. If you want those, go buy one of those other ones that don't work. Safe. And then go. Sorry about that for any of the practitioners out there. I'm an SPC, by the way.
Yeah,
but
me too. So
yes, so we all have our crosses to bear. But go out there, and so the idea is it's to enable you to find a wider range of tools, techniques, methods, and approaches, and understand how to apply them in varying and in different contexts to make you more successful as coaches, practitioners, as people who help organizations. I'm talking too much. I'm sorry to the people who host this event.
Oh, no, you're fine.
So I did open up and share the links over here on the right-hand side of the mural. And Nigel, to your point, what I'll do is I'll add the link to the UNT and where the book can be found online. So,
Sure.
So, again, going back to the audience, because we do have about 5 minutes remaining. Does anybody have any questions for myself or Nigel?